The frozen letter clutched in his gloved hand trembled as Declan Ingram read the desperate words scrawled in elegant script, the ink smudged by what could only have been tears, and he knew without question that he would ride through hell itself to find the woman who had written it. The blizzard had struck Tonopah Junction, Nevada 3 days earlier, an unusual fury of white that transformed the desert mining town into something unrecognizable. Snow piled against the wooden storefronts, and the wind howled through the streets like a wounded animal. Declan had been checking on his horses in the stable behind the Silver Star Saloon when he noticed something odd wedged beneath a drift near the back fence. At first he thought it was just debris blown in by the storm, but something made him dig through the snow with his bare hands until he pulled free a leather satchel, frozen stiff and covered in ice. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly protected it from the elements, was the letter. The envelope bore no address, just a single word written in that same careful hand. Help. Declan had carried it inside to the warmth of the saloon's back room, where he worked as both a ranch hand and occasional guard. His fingers, still numb from the cold, fumbled with the envelope as he broke the wax seal. The paper inside was fine quality, the kind that wealthy folks back east used for important correspondence, but the words written on it spoke of anything but comfort or safety. To whoever finds this, it began. My name is Margaret Morrison, and I am being held against my will at the Silverbrook mining camp, 15 miles north of Tonopah Junction. My uncle, Harold Morrison, brought me here from San Francisco 3 months ago under the pretense of managing his mining operation. But upon arrival, I discovered his true intentions. He plans to force me into marriage with his business partner, a cruel man named Vincent Shaw, to consolidate their claims and fortune. I have no money, no horse, and no means of escape. The camp is isolated, and the men who work there are loyal to my uncle through fear and coin. I managed to bribe a supply driver to carry this letter to town, though I do not know if it will reach anyone who might help. I am 22 years old and I am afraid. If you are reading this, please, I beg you, send word to the territorial marshal or come yourself if you are able. I am running out of time. The wedding is planned for the first day the storm clears. Yours in desperation, Margaret Morrison. The date on the letter was 4 days old. The storm had cleared that very morning. Declan read the letter 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. He was 25 years old, had been working cattle and odd jobs since he was 14, and had seen enough of the world to know that men like Harold Morrison existed in every corner of the West. Men who saw people, especially women, as property to be bought, sold, or traded for personal gain. The thought of this Margaret Morrison, trapped and afraid, waiting for help that might never come, made something fierce and protective surge in his chest. The territorial marshal was 2 days' ride south in better weather. Even if Declan could get word to him, it would be too late. The storm might have cleared in town, but the mountains to the north would still be treacherous, the passes filled with snow and ice. Any sensible man would wait, would think it through, would consider the risks. Declan had never claimed to be particularly sensible. He found Tom Brennan, the saloon owner, tallying receipts at the bar. The afternoon crowd was thin, just a few miners warming themselves by the stove and nursing whiskey to chase away the lingering cold. I need to borrow a horse, Declan said without preamble. The roan mare, if you can spare her. And supplies for a hard ride north. Tom looked up, his weathered face creasing with concern. North? Boy, you saw what that storm did to this town. Up in the mountains, it will be 10 times worse. What could possibly be worth risking your neck in that mess? Declan handed him the letter. Tom read it slowly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set the paper down carefully on the bar top and met Declan's eyes. "This is real trouble, son. Harold Morrison is a powerful man. He owns half the mining operations in this territory, has connections in Carson City and beyond. You ride up there and interfere with his business, he will make sure you pay for it." "Then I will pay," Declan said simply. "I cannot leave her there. You read what she wrote. They are going to force her into marriage with a man she fears. What kind of man would I be if I turned my back on that?" Tom studied him for a long moment, then sighed and pulled a key from his vest pocket. "The roan is yours, and I will pack you supplies." "But Declan, you need to understand what you are riding into. Silverbrook is not just a mining camp. It is Morrison's private kingdom. He has armed men, and they will not take kindly to some cowboy showing up and making demands." "I am not going to make demands," Declan said. "I am going to get her out of there." "How?" "I will figure that out when I arrive." Tom shook his head but went to gather supplies. Within an hour, Declan had the roan saddled and loaded with everything he would need: bedroll, extra ammunition for his Colt revolver, dried beef, hardtack, coffee, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a heavy wool coat that Tom insisted he take. The older man also pressed a silver flask into his hand. "Whiskey," Tom said. "For warmth and courage, though I suspect you have plenty of the latter and damn little sense to go with it. If you are not back in 4 days, I will send word to the marshal." "If I am not back in 4 days, the marshal will not be much help," Declan replied, but he clasped Tom's hand firmly. "Thank you. For the horse and the supplies, I will bring her back. Bring yourself back too," Tom said. "This town could use more men with your particular brand of foolish nobility." The ride north began easy enough. The main trail out of Tonopah Junction had been used by supply wagons even during the storm, so the snow was packed down and navigable. The sky overhead was a hard, clear blue, the kind of crystalline winter sky that made everything seem sharp and brittle. Declan kept the roan at a steady pace, not wanting to tire her too quickly. The mare was a good animal, sure-footed and calm, with enough stamina to handle the mountain trails. As the afternoon wore on and the elevation increased, the conditions worsened. The packed trail gave way to deep snow that reached the mare's knees in places. Declan had to dismount several times to lead her through particularly treacherous sections, where ice had formed over rocks and deadfall. The temperature dropped steadily, and despite the heavy coat, he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. He thought about Margaret Morrison as he rode. What kind of woman wrote a letter like that? Educated, certainly. The handwriting was refined, the language precise even in desperation. But there was steel beneath those careful words too. She had not simply accepted her fate. She had fought back in the only way available to her, entrusting her plea to chance and the kindness of strangers. That took courage. Declan had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 5 brothers on a farm that could barely support 3. At 15, he had headed west with nothing but a horse and his father's old Navy Colt, looking for work and opportunity. He had found both, along with hard lessons about the kind of men who thrived on the frontier. Some were good, honest folk trying to build something lasting. Others were predators who saw the lawless territories as places where they could indulge their worst impulses without consequence. He had worked ranches in Colorado, freight lines in Utah, even spent 6 months as a deputy in a nothing town in Arizona before deciding that wearing a badge was not for him. The law, he had learned, was only as strong as the men who enforced it and the communities that supported it. In places where powerful men held sway, justice was a commodity that could be bought and sold like everything else. That was why he had not even considered waiting for the marshal. Men like Harold Morrison did not fear the law. They owned it. Night fell quickly in the mountains, the temperature plummeting with the sun. Declan made camp in a small hollow beneath an overhang of rock that provided some shelter from the wind. He cleared a space in the snow and built a small fire, just enough to warm his hands and heat some coffee. The roan he tethered close, covering her with a blanket and giving her a good portion of the grain he had brought. As he sat by the fire, sipping bitter coffee and chewing on dried beef, he pulled out the letter again. In the flickering firelight, he studied Margaret's handwriting, looking for clues about the woman behind the words. The letters were formed with care but not pretension. There were small flourishes to the capital letters, suggesting someone who took pride in doing things well. But the smudges and slight irregularities told of fear and haste. She had written this in secret, probably by candlelight, knowing that discovery could mean worse than what she already faced. "I am coming," he said quietly to the letter to the night, to Margaret Morrison wherever she was in the darkness ahead. "Hold on a little longer. I am coming." He slept fitly, waking several times to feed the fire and check on the horse. Each time he woke, he thought about turning back, about the insanity of what he was doing. He did not know this woman. He had no stake in her troubles beyond the letter and his own conscience. Men died in the mountains every winter, their bodies found in spring thaws, frozen monuments to poor judgment and bad luck. But each time, he wrapped himself tighter in his bedroll and waited for dawn, knowing he would continue north as soon as there was light enough to see. The second day was worse than the first. The trail, such as it was, became nearly impossible to follow beneath the snow. Declan navigated by landmarks when he could find them and by instinct when he could not. The wind picked up, driving flurries of snow into his face and making visibility difficult. Twice the roan broke through ice covering hidden streams, and both times Declan had to work quickly to free her before the freezing water could do damage. By midday, his face was raw from the cold despite the scarf he had wrapped around it. His fingers felt like wooden sticks inside his gloves, and his feet had gone numb in his boots. The whiskey Tom had given him helped, small sips that burned down his throat and spread temporary warmth through his chest, but he rationed it carefully. Drunk men died faster than sober ones in weather like this. As the short winter afternoon began to fade, Declan spotted smoke rising in the distance. A lot of smoke, the kind that came from multiple buildings and industry. Silverbrook. It had to be. He was closer than he had dared hope, but arriving with daylight fading was not ideal. He needed to see the layout of the camp, understand what he was dealing with before he made his move. He found another shelter, this time a thick stand of pines whose branches had kept the worst of the snow from accumulating beneath them. After seeing to the roan, he climbed a rocky outcrop that gave him a view down into the valley where the mining camp lay. Silverbrook was bigger than he had expected. At least 20 buildings clustered around the mine entrances, which were dark holes in the mountainside surrounded by piles of tailings and equipment. He could see men moving between buildings, small dark figures against the snow. Lights began to appear in windows as lamps were lit against the growing darkness. One building, larger than the others and set slightly apart, had smoke rising from 2 chimneys and curtains visible in the windows. That would be the main house, where Morrison likely kept his offices and living quarters, where he kept Margaret. Declan studied the camp until full dark, memorizing the layout and watching the patterns of movement. Guards, at least 4 that he could see, patrolling the perimeter. Not heavily armed from what he could tell at this distance, but present nonetheless. The miners themselves would not be a problem if he could avoid them. Men who worked for wages did not typically die for their employer's personal business. The real question was how to get Margaret out without starting a war he could not win. 4 guards he might handle. 20 angry men, even unarmed miners, would overwhelm him through sheer numbers. He needed to be smart about this, surgical. He needed to talk to her first. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Declan's plan, such as it was, relied on bold audacity and a gamble about human nature. He cleaned himself up as best he could with snow and changed into the cleaner of his 2 shirts. Then he rode straight into Silverbrook as if he had every right to be there, approaching from the main trail that supply wagons would use. The first guard he encountered was a young man, no more than 20, huddled in a coat near the camp entrance. "Help you?" The guard asked, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip, but his tone more curious than hostile. "Looking for work," Declan said easily. Heard Morrison was hiring. Figure a camp this size could use another hand, especially after that storm. "I am good with horses, decent with a hammer, and I do not mind hard work in cold weather." The guard relaxed slightly. "We got men enough for the mine, but you should talk to Garrett. He runs the practical side of things. Big man, usually in the equipment shed this time of morning." He pointed toward a long building near the mine entrance. "Tell him Pete sent you." "Appreciate it," Declan said, tipping his hat and riding on before the guard could ask more questions. The camp was coming to life around him. Miners emerged from a bunkhouse, heading toward the mine entrance with lunch pails and tools. A cook stood in the doorway of what was obviously a mess hall, ringing a bell for breakfast. Everything looked depressingly normal, as if this were just another mining operation and not a prison for a desperate woman. Declan did not go to the equipment shed. Instead, he guided the roan around the perimeter of the camp, keeping to the edges and watching for an opportunity. The main house, as he had suspected, was the largest and finest building. 2 stories with real glass windows and a covered porch. A woman's touch was visible in the curtains and the plants that someone had attempted to keep alive despite the cold. Margaret's touch, perhaps. As he watched, the front door opened and a man emerged. He was in his 50s, Declan guessed, well-dressed in clothes more suited to a San Francisco drawing room than a Nevada mining camp. His face was florid, his posture that of a man accustomed to authority and deference. "Harold Morrison," without a doubt. Morrison shouted something back into the house, then walked toward another building that might have been an office. This was the opportunity Declan needed. He dismounted quickly, tying the roan loosely to a post near the back of the main house. If he needed to leave quickly, he wanted the horse ready. The back door was unlocked. Declan slipped inside, finding himself in a kitchen that was empty but warm, a stove radiating heat. He moved quickly through the house, listening for voices or footsteps. The main floor appeared empty, everyone either outside or upstairs. He climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step for creaks. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions. 3 doors, all closed. Behind one of them, he could hear someone moving. "Miss Morrison," he called softly. "Margaret Morrison." The movement stopped. Then a voice, cautious and afraid. "Who is there?" "My name is Declan Ingram. I found your letter in Tanapa Junction. I came to help you." A door at the end of the hall flew open, and suddenly he was looking at her. Margaret Morrison was tall, nearly as tall as his own 5'10", with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, well-made but practical, and her face was pale with shock. "You came," she whispered. "You actually came." "I came," he confirmed, keeping his voice low. "But we do not have much time. Is there anyone else in the house?" The cook, but she is in her room on the first floor. She is elderly and hard of hearing. My uncle just left for the office." Margaret moved closer, her hands clasped tightly together. "You should not be here. If they find you, they will kill you. Harold has men who would do it without question." "Then we need to leave before they find me. Can you ride?" "Yes, but there are guards. They watch me constantly." "I am only alone in the mornings when Harold is in his office and Vincent is at the mine. Even then, I am not allowed past the front porch." "Vincent Shaw." "Your uncle's partner," her face hardened. "The man they intend me to marry tomorrow. He is worse than my uncle in every way." "Harold, at least, is motivated by greed. Vincent enjoys cruelty for its own sake." Declan made a decision. "Get whatever you need. Warm clothes, anything you cannot live without. We leave in 5 minutes. How? They will stop us before we reach the camp gates." "Not if we go over the mountain instead of through the camp. I saw a trail on the eastern ridge. It will be rough, but it will get us away from here." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes. Fear of the unknown versus fear of what waited if she stayed. Then she straightened her shoulders and nodded. 5 minutes, she agreed, and disappeared back into her room. Declan used the time to scout the upstairs, looking for anything useful. In what appeared to be Harold Morrison's room, he found a strongbox. It was locked, but a few hard strikes with the iron poker from the fireplace broke it open. Inside was more money than Declan had seen in years, neat stacks of bills and gold coins. He hesitated for only a moment before taking several handfuls of bills and a decent amount of gold. If he was going to help Margaret escape, she would need money to start over somewhere her uncle could not reach her. Margaret emerged wearing a heavy coat and carrying a small bag. She had changed into split riding skirts and practical boots. Her hair was still pinned up, but she had wrapped a scarf around her neck. "I am ready," she said. They moved quickly down the stairs and through the kitchen. Declan looked out the back door first, checking for guards or workers who might spot them. The way was clear, but it would not stay that way for long. "We will have to share the horse until we are well away from the camp," he told her. "She is strong, but we will move faster with 2 horses." "Is there a stable here?" "Yes, on the north side, but it is always guarded and they keep strict count of the animals." "Then we share." They made it to where the roan waited. Declan mounted first, then reached down to pull Margaret up behind him. She settled onto the horse's rump, her arms wrapping around his waist for balance. Even through the heavy coats, he could feel her trembling. "Hold tight," he said, and urged the roan forward. They did not take the main trail. Instead, Declan guided the horse behind buildings, using every bit of cover the camp provided. The eastern edge of Silverbrook was less developed, mostly storage buildings and equipment. Beyond it, the mountain rose steeply, covered in snow and pine trees. They were almost clear when someone shouted behind them. "Hey, that is Morrison's niece. Stop!" Declan kicked the roan into a gallop, heading straight for the tree line. Behind them, more shouts erupted. A gunshot cracked through the cold air, but the bullet went wide, striking a tree to their left. The roan plunged into the forest, snow flying from her hooves. Low branches whipped past, and Declan had to duck to avoid being swept from the saddle. Margaret pressed close against his back, her grip tight around his middle. More shots echoed behind them, but the trees provided cover and the distance was growing. The slope was brutal, testing the mare's strength and sure-footedness. Several times she stumbled, and Declan had to use every bit of his skill to keep them all upright. But the roan was game, pushing forward with the determination of a horse that understood the stakes. They climbed for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. When they finally crested the ridge, Declan risked a look back. He could see men mounting horses at the camp, organizing a pursuit. But the terrain up here was treacherous, and the snow was deep. It would slow the pursuers as much as it slowed them. "We need to keep moving," he said. "They will follow, and they know this mountain better than I do." "There is a line shack," Margaret said breathlessly, "about 5 miles east of here. Hunters use it in the fall. It might be empty." It was something, at least. A destination. Declan turned the roan east and pushed on. The next hours were a test of endurance for all of them. The ridge trail was treacherous, winding through stands of timber and across open snowfields where the wind howled and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The roan was tiring, her breathing labored and her steps less certain. Declan knew they could not push her much further without risking injury or worse. Margaret had gone quiet behind him, but her arms remained firm around his waist. He could feel her body pressed against his back, could feel the occasional shudder that might have been cold or fear or both. Every instinct he had screamed at him to stop, to give them all a rest, but the memory of those men mounting horses kept him moving forward. Finally, as the short winter day began to fade again, Margaret spoke. "There, through those trees." The line shack was barely more than a lean-to, a single-room structure built of rough logs with a stone chimney and a roof that had seen better days. But it had 4 walls and a door, and right now that was paradise. Declan dismounted first, then helped Margaret down. She nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground, her legs cramped from the long ride. He caught her, steadying her until she could stand on her own. "Get inside," he said. "I will see to the horse." The shack's interior was basic but functional. A stone fireplace, a rough wooden bunk with a bare mattress that looked relatively intact, a small table and 2 chairs. Someone had left a stack of firewood and some old blankets. Declan got Margaret settled with the blankets while he worked on starting a fire. His hands were so cold he could barely hold the matches, but eventually he got kindling burning, then added larger pieces until a real fire was crackling in the hearth. Only then did he see to the roan. He could not risk a light outside, so he worked by feel and the faint glow from the shack's single window. The mare was exhausted and cold, her coat damp with sweat despite the freezing temperature. He rubbed her down as best he could with handfuls of snow and the saddle blanket, then covered her with his bedroll and gave her the last of the grain. She deserved better, but it was all he could offer. When he finally returned inside, Margaret had moved close to the fire. She had removed her coat and scarf, and in the firelight he got his first real look at her. She was beautiful, but not in the delicate, porcelain way of society women. There was strength in her features, in the firm line of her jaw and the direct way she met his eyes. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, dark strands falling around her face. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming, for risking your life. I wrote that letter without any real hope, and then you appeared like something out of a dream." Declan shook his head. "Do not thank me yet. We are not safe. Morrison will have men scouring these mountains, and we left tracks in the snow that a child could follow. Then what do? We rest tonight, get our strength back. In the morning we move again before first light. Head south and east, work our way toward the main trails. Once we are far enough from Silverbrook, we will be harder to track." Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying him in the firelight. "Why did you come? You do not know me. This is not your fight." It was a fair question. Declan considered several answers before settling on the truth. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I know what it is like to feel trapped, to need someone to give you a chance. Someone did that for me once. I suppose I am paying it forward." "Tell me," Margaret said softly, so he did. As they shared the dried beef and hardtack from his supplies, Declan told her about his childhood in Missouri. about leaving home too young and too proud, about nearly starving that first winter in Colorado, until a ranch owner named Samuel took a chance on a scrawny kid who did not know the first thing about working cattle, about learning to survive in a hard land that did not suffer fools or weakness in turn. Margaret told him her story. She had grown up in San Francisco, the only child of a shipping merchant who died when she was 18. Her mother had passed years earlier, leaving her in the care of her Uncle Harold, her father's brother. For a while, things had been fine. Harold managed her inheritance and the business, and Margaret lived a comfortable life, wanting for nothing. But comfort was not freedom, and gradually Margaret realized that her uncle saw her as an asset to be managed, not a person with her own wishes and dreams. When Vincent Shaw appeared, a business partner with mining interests and political connections, Harold saw an opportunity. Marry Margaret to Vincent, consolidate their business empires, and ensure his own position of power. I refused, of course, Margaret said, her voice tight with remembered anger. I told him I would never marry a man like Vincent Shaw, that I would rather live in poverty. That was when Harold brought me here, told me I needed to see the business that would be my husband's. Except once we arrived, I realized I was a prisoner. No money, no transportation, no way to send word to anyone in San Francisco who might help. What about Shaw? Declan asked. You said he was worse than your uncle. Margaret's face darkened. Vincent enjoys intimidation. He thinks fear is the same as respect. He has been, thankfully, too busy with the mine operations to pay much attention to me. But when we spoke, I could see it in his eyes. He does not want a wife. He wants property that can talk and sign legal documents. After the marriage, I have no illusions about what my life would be. Declan felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. He had seen men like Shaw before, men who viewed women as commodities, as objects to be used and controlled. The fact that the law would actually support such a marriage, that Harold Morrison could legally compel his niece to wed against her will through manipulation and control of her finances, made him want to put his fist through something. You are free now, he said firmly. Whatever happens, you are not going back there, I promise you that. Margaret met his eyes and something passed between them in that moment, recognition perhaps or understanding. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers warm from the fire. I believe you, she said. They took turns keeping watch through the night, though Declan insisted Margaret sleep first. She protested, but exhaustion won out, and within minutes of lying down on the bunk, she was asleep. Declan sat by the fire, his Colt in his lap, listening to the night sounds and trying to plan their next moves. They needed to get to a town large enough to have both a telegraph and real law enforcement. Somewhere Margaret could wire her father's lawyers in San Francisco and start the process of reclaiming her inheritance and her life. But more immediately, they needed to evade Harold Morrison's men and survive the mountain winter. He found himself watching Margaret as she slept. Even in rest, there was a tension to her, as if some part of her remained alert for danger. She had been strong through everything, had not complained once during the brutal ride or their desperate escape. Most society women he had known would have been hysterical or helpless. Margaret Morrison was neither. When it was her turn to keep watch, she woke quickly at his touch and insisted he rest. Declan lay down on the floor near the fire, using his coat as a pillow. Sleep came harder for him, his mind racing with possibilities and problems. But eventually, exhaustion claimed him too. He woke to Margaret's hand on his shoulder and her urgent whisper. Declan, someone is coming. Dawn was just breaking, gray light filtering through the cracks in the shuttered window. Declan was on his feet instantly, gun in hand. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap. 3 riders, moving slowly along the ridge trail they had used the day before. They were still a quarter-mile away, but they were definitely tracking, following the obvious trail in the snow. "We need to go," Declan said. "Now." They gathered their few belongings in seconds. Declan kicked snow over the remains of their fire and brushed away signs of their presence as best he could in the few moments they had. It would not fool anyone, but it might buy them minutes, and minutes could make the difference. The roan looked better after a night's rest, though Declan knew they could not push her as hard as they had the previous day. He helped Margaret mount first this time, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. They moved east, away from the approaching riders, keeping to the trees where the snow was thinner. Behind them, faint shouts indicated that their pursuers had found the line shack. The hunt was on again. For 3 hours, they played a desperate game of cat and mouse through the mountains. Declan used every trick he knew to obscure their trail, riding through streams where the ice was thin, doubling back to confuse the track, even splitting off and rejoining to create false trails. Margaret held on to him, her body tense but her trust absolute as he guided them through increasingly dangerous terrain. But the pursuers were persistent and knew the land better. By midday, Declan could tell they were being herded, pushed toward a narrow canyon that would limit their options. He was trying to figure out how to break the pattern when fate intervened in the form of another winter storm. It came up fast, as mountain storms do, the sky darkening and snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Within 20 minutes, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. It was dangerous, potentially deadly, but it was also opportunity. "Hold on tight," Declan told Margaret and urged the roan down a steep slope that was barely visible through the snow. They descended rapidly, the horse half sliding down the mountain. It was reckless, the kind of thing that could break a leg or a neck, but Declan was counting on their pursuers being too cautious to follow immediately. The storm would cover their tracks, and if they could get far enough ahead, they might finally shake free. The slope eventually leveled out into a narrow valley that ran roughly south. A frozen creek bed provided a clear path, and Declan followed it as the storm raged around them. The world became nothing but white and gray and cold, the snow so thick he could barely see past the roan's ears. They rode through the storm for hours, both of them soaked and freezing. Margaret shivered constantly against him, and Declan knew they were approaching the limits of what their bodies could endure. They needed shelter, warmth, or they would not survive the night. As if in answer to his desperate thoughts, the storm began to break. The snow lightened, and suddenly he could see a dark shape ahead through the trees. As they drew closer, it resolved into a small cabin, much more substantial than the line shack. Smoke rose from a chimney, which meant someone was home. Declan approached cautiously, dismounting and helping Margaret down. They were both so cold they could barely stand. He half carried her to the door and knocked. The man who answered was in his 60s, lean and weathered with gray hair and shrewd blue eyes. He took in their condition with a single glance. "Storm catch you?" he asked. "Something like that," Declan managed through chattering teeth. "Well, do not just stand there. Get inside before you freeze to death." The cabin's interior was wonderfully warm. A fire roared in a large stone fireplace, and the single room was well organized and clean. The man helped Declan get Margaret to a chair near the fire, then brought blankets and hot coffee. "Name is William Barnes," he said. "I am a trapper, been working these mountains for 30 years. You two look like you have been through hell." "Close enough," Declan agreed. As the warmth began to seep back into his body, he made a decision. William Barnes had the look of a man who understood the mountains and the unwritten codes of frontier justice. Declan told him an abbreviated version of their story: Margaret's imprisonment, the forced marriage, their escape. William listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker. When Declan finished, the old trapper spat into the fire. "Harold Morrison," he said with disgust. "I know of him. Bought up half the mining claims in this territory, usually by forcing out the men who found them first. Uses the law when it suits him and ignores it when it does not. You were right to get the girl away from him." "They were following us," Margaret said, her voice still shaky from the cold. "3 men at least. Will they find us here?" "Not in this storm, and not if they have any sense," William said. "That was a real blow came down off the high peaks. Anyone still out in it is risking their lives. But come morning they might pick up your trail again." "Then we will leave at first light," Declan said. "No," William said firmly. "You will leave now while the storm is still clearing. The trail south joins up with the main road to Tanapa Junction about 10 miles from here. If you push through now, you will hit that road by midnight. Once you are on it, your trail will mix with freight wagons and other traffic. Morrison's men will not be able to follow." "We cannot ask you to help us," Margaret protested. "If my uncle finds out, he could make trouble for you." William grinned, showing several missing teeth. "Girl, I am 63 years old and have been living in these mountains longer than Morrison has been out of short pants. He does not scare me. Besides, I never liked the son of a bitch." He stood and began gathering items from around the cabin. "I will give you food, warm clothes for the lady, and directions to the road. That is the best I can offer." "That is more than enough," Declan said. "Thank you." William outfitted them well. Margaret got a thick wool coat that was too large but much warmer than her own, along with better gloves and a fur hat. He packed them food that would last several days and refilled Declan's ammunition from his own supplies. Most importantly, he gave them clear directions to the main road and advice on which towns to avoid. "There is a settlement called Pine Ridge about 30 miles south of where you will hit the road," William said. "Nothing fancy, but the sheriff there, John Kendrick, is honest. He will help you get word to the territorial authorities, and he will not be bought off by Morrison's money." They left as the last of the storm clouds were clearing, revealing a star-filled sky. The roan seemed refreshed from the warm stable and the good grain William had fed her. Margaret rode behind Declan again, her new coat wrapped tightly around her and her arms secure around his waist. "We keep meeting good people," she said softly as they rode away from William's cabin. "First you, now him. I had started to believe that kindness was a fairy tale." "There is plenty of kindness in the world," Declan replied. "The problem is that cruel men make more noise, so they seem more numerous than they are. For every Harold Morrison, there are a dozen William Barnes. We just have to remember that." They rode through the night, following William's directions. The old trapper had been right about the trail. It was rough but passable, winding down out of the high country toward the more traveled lowlands. The roan settled into a steady pace, and the miles passed in companionable silence. Declan found himself acutely aware of Margaret's presence behind him. The weight of her body pressed against his back, the way her arms tightened around him when the trail grew steep or rough. She trusted him completely, had placed her life and freedom in his hands without hesitation. That trust was both humbling and terrifying. He thought about what would happen when they reached safety. Margaret would contact her lawyers, would fight to reclaim her inheritance and her independence. She would return to San Francisco, to a life of comfort and society that was as foreign to Declan as the mountains were to her. And he would go back to Tanapa Junction, to his work at the Silver Star and his simple life as a ranch hand and odd jobs cowboy. The thought created an unexpected ache in his chest. They reached the main road just as William had predicted, around midnight. The transition was startling after days in the wilderness. The road was wide and well-traveled, packed snow showing the marks of wagon wheels and horse hooves. It represented civilization, safety, and the beginning of the end of their journey together. Declan turned south, and they continued through what remained of the night. Dawn found them both exhausted but still moving. The landscape had changed, the high mountains giving way to rolling foothills and scattered stands of timber. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from what had to be Pine Ridge. "We made it," Margaret said, and there was relief in her voice but also something else. Sadness, maybe, or regret. "We made it," Declan agreed. Pine Ridge was indeed nothing fancy, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a crossroads. But it had a sheriff's office with a faded star painted on the door, and that was what mattered. Declan helped Margaret down from the horse, and together they walked up the steps. Sheriff John Kendrick was a solid man in his 40s with iron-gray hair and intelligent eyes. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer as the tale unfolded. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "I have heard of Harold Morrison," he said. "He has never operated in my territory, thank God, but his reputation reaches far. What you are describing is criminal, plain and simple. Unlawful detention, attempted forced marriage through coercion. The territorial courts will want to hear about this." "Can you send a wire to San Francisco?" Margaret asked. "To Garrison and Holt, attorneys at law. They handled my father's affairs and should still have access to my accounts." "I can and will," Kendrick assured her, "but it may take time. Morrison has influence and he will fight this. You need somewhere safe to stay while the legal matters are sorted out." "She can stay at the hotel," Declan said. "I have money." He pulled out the bills and gold he had taken from Morrison's strongbox. "This should cover it." Kendrick raised an eyebrow. "Morrison's money, I would guess." He owed Miss Morrison years of wages for the work he forced her to do managing his affairs, Declan said evenly. "I would call this partial payment." The sheriff actually smiled at that. "I would call it justice. All right, here is what we are going to do. Miss Morrison, you will stay at the hotel under a false name for now, just until we can be sure Morrison does not have men looking for you here. Mr. Ingram, you are welcome to stay as well, though I would appreciate it if you would stop by my office tomorrow. I will need a full written statement from both of you for the territorial prosecutor." They agreed, and Kendrick directed them to the Pine Ridge Hotel, a modest two-story building that looked clean and well-kept. The proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Chen, asked no questions when Kendrick vouched for them. She gave Margaret a room on the second floor and offered Declan one next door. "I will have hot water sent up," Mrs. Chen said kindly, looking at Margaret's exhausted face. "And food. You look like you could use both." In the hallway outside their rooms, Declan and Margaret stood facing each other. In the daylight streaming through the window at the end of the hall, he could see the toll the last few days had taken. Her face was pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. But she was standing tall, her chin raised, and there was determination in her gaze. "Thank you, Declan," she said softly. "For everything. I know I keep saying that, but I do not know what other words to use. You saved my life. You gave me back my freedom." "You would have found a way," Declan said, though he was not sure he believed it. "You are strong. You would have survived. Maybe. But I am glad I did not have to do it alone." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Will you stay, at least for a few days, until we know what Morrison is going to do?" Declan knew he should refuse. Every hour he spent with Margaret Morrison, He could feel himself falling further into something that could only end in heartache. They were from different worlds, and once her legal troubles were resolved, she would return to San Francisco and the life she deserved. What could a cowboy with no prospects and no home offer a woman like her? But looking into her storm-gray eyes, he could not make himself say no. "I will stay," he promised, "until you are safe." The next week passed in a strange limbo. Sheriff Kendrick sent wires to San Francisco, to Carson City, to the territorial prosecutor's office. Responses came back slowly, slowed by winter weather and the complexity of the legal issues involved. Margaret's lawyers confirmed her identity and began the process of challenging Harold Morrison's control of her inheritance. Morrison himself arrived in Pine Ridge on the fourth day, riding in with Vincent Shaw and 6 armed men. Kendrick met them at the edge of town, backed by 3 deputies, and made it clear that any attempt to take Margaret by force would result in arrests. "She is my niece," Morrison blustered, his face red with anger. "She is not in her right mind. This cowboy kidnapped her, filled her head with lies." "That is not what Miss Morrison says," Kendrick replied calmly. "And she is of legal age and sound mind. She has the right to stay where she chooses. If you have a legal claim, you can present it to the territorial courts. Until then, she is under my protection." Morrison threatened lawsuits, political connections, ruin for everyone involved. But Kendrick held firm, and eventually Morrison and his men rode away. Still, the threat hung over everything. Morrison was not the type to give up easily. Through it all, Declan stayed close. He took a room at the hotel and spent his days helping where he could, running errands for the sheriff, keeping watch for any sign of Morrison's men returning. But mostly, he spent time with Margaret. They walked through Pine Ridge together, despite the cold, talking for hours. Margaret told him about growing up in San Francisco, about her dreams of traveling, of seeing the places she had only read about in books. Declan told her stories of his years drifting through the West, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned. They discovered shared passions for reading, though Margaret's education far exceeded his. She loved poetry and philosophy. He preferred adventure stories and practical books about ranching and animal husbandry. She taught him about classical music, humming melodies and explaining their history. He taught her about horses, about how to read weather and track game. In the evenings, they would sit in the hotel parlor, sometimes with other guests, but often alone. Mrs. Chen was a romantic at heart and seemed to engineer opportunities for them to be together. They would sit by the fire, talking or reading or just existing in comfortable silence. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Declan realized he had fallen in love with her. The recognition came like a lightning strike, sudden and undeniable. He looked up from the book he was pretending to read and found Margaret watching the fire, her face soft and unguarded. The light played across her features, highlighting the strength and beauty he had come to know so well. And he knew with absolute certainty that he loved her, that he would love her for the rest of his life, whether or not she ever felt the same way. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange peace. Whatever happened, he had this moment, this time with her. That would have to be enough. 2 weeks after their arrival in Pine Ridge, a telegram arrived from San Francisco. Margaret's lawyers had successfully petitioned the courts to freeze Harold Morrison's access to her accounts pending a full investigation. Moreover, they had uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement and possible fraud. Morrison was being summoned to San Francisco to answer questions under oath. "It is over," Margaret said, holding the telegram with shaking hands. "I can go home. I can have my life back." "That is wonderful," Declan said, and meant it, even as his heart broke a little. You must be so relieved. I am, she said, then quieter. I am also sad. Sad? Why? She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. Because going home means leaving you. And I do not want to do that. Declan felt the world tilt. Margaret, I do not understand. Do you not? She set the telegram aside and moved closer to him. They were in the hotel parlor, alone for once. Snow was falling outside the windows, but inside the fire crackled warmly. Declan, these past 2 weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything. Not because of where we are or what we have been through, but because of you. Because of who you are and how you make me feel. I am nobody, Declan protested. I am a cowboy with no money and no prospects. You are going back to San Francisco, to your life there. My life there is empty without you, Margaret said simply. I have been thinking about this constantly. I do not want to go back to being the person I was before. That life was a cage, just a more comfortable one than my uncle's. I want to be free, truly free, and I want to be with you. You are not thinking clearly, Declan said desperately. You have been through trauma. You are confusing gratitude with something else. Do not tell me what I am feeling, Margaret said, and there was steel in her voice. I am a grown woman who knows her own mind. I know the difference between gratitude and love. And I love you, Declan Ingram. I love your courage and your kindness. I love the way you see the world and the way you treat people. I love that you risked everything for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I love you and I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. Declan stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. You love me. I love you, she confirmed. The question is, do you love me? He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her face in his hands. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone, he said hoarsely. But Margaret, your life is in San Francisco, your friends, your society, everything you know. I cannot ask you to give that up. You are not asking, I am choosing. Declan, that life was never really mine. It was what my father wanted, what society expected, but it was not what I wanted. I want adventure. I want freedom. I want a life that matters, where I can be myself instead of playing a role. She covered his hands with hers. I want you. The question is, do you want me? Not as some fragile society woman you need to protect, but as a partner, as an equal. Yes, Declan said and kissed her. It was their first kiss, and it was everything a first kiss should be. Gentle and fierce at once, full of promise and hope and barely contained passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Declan rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I will love you forever. But are you sure? Once you make this choice, your life will be completely different. People in San Francisco will talk. Your uncle and his associates will never forgive you, and life out here is hard. I am sure, Margaret said firmly. I have never been more sure of anything. Besides, I am not giving up everything. My lawyers are reclaiming my inheritance, which means I will have resources. We can use that money to build something together. A ranch, maybe, or a business. Something that is ours. A ranch, Declan repeated, the idea taking root. I have always wanted to run my own operation. Actually build something instead of just working for wages. Then that is what we will do, Margaret said. Together, as partners in every sense of the word. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, their voices low and excited. They would go to San Francisco together, face whatever social consequences came from Margaret's choice to marry a cowboy. She would settle her legal affairs, ensure that Harold Morrison could never threaten her again. Then they would return west, find land suitable for ranching, and build their life together. It would not be easy. They both knew that. But sitting there by the fire, hands clasped and futures intertwined, easy was not what they wanted. They wanted real and true, and earned through effort and love. The next morning, Declan went to Sheriff Kendrick's office. "I need to ask you about the legal requirements for getting married in Nevada," he said without preamble. Kendrick's weathered face split into a grin. "Took you long enough. I have been watching you two dance around each other for weeks. There is a circuit judge who comes through Pine Ridge once a month. He will be here in 3 days. Or, if you do not want to wait, there is a justice of the peace in Carson City who can do it." "3 days is fine," Declan said. "I want to do this right. Miss Morrison deserves a proper wedding, even if it is small. Let me know if you need anything," Kendrick said. "And Ingram, you are a good man. That woman chose well." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Chen, delighted by the romance unfolding under her roof, insisted on helping arrange everything. She enlisted other women in town, and somehow they produced a simple but beautiful dress for Margaret, altered from a gown someone had brought west and never worn. The hotel parlor was decorated with pine boughs and white ribbons. Declan used some of Morrison's gold to buy a ring from the general store, a simple band of silver that was all Pine Ridge had to offer. It was not fancy, but when he showed it to Margaret, she smiled with such joy that he knew it was perfect. "It is beautiful," she said, "just like everything else about this." The wedding took place on a cold but clear morning. Sheriff Kendrick stood up with Declan and Mrs. Chen with Margaret. The circuit judge, a kindly man named Thompson, performed the ceremony in the hotel parlor. Half of Pine Ridge seemed to have found reasons to be at the hotel that morning, crowding in to witness the unusual union. When Judge Thompson asked if anyone objected, there was a moment of tension as the door opened. But it was only William Barnes, the trapper who had helped them in the mountains. He had traveled 2 days to attend the wedding, bringing with him a beautiful fur blanket as a gift. "Could not let you two start your life together without a proper blessing from the mountains," William said gruffly. Declan and Margaret exchanged vows, their voices steady and sure. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was met with cheers and applause. It was not the society wedding Margaret might have had in San Francisco, but standing there in her simple dress with her cowboy husband, she had never looked happier. The celebration lasted through the afternoon. Mrs. Chen provided a feast, and someone produced a fiddle. There was dancing and laughter, and for a few hours the weight of their troubles lifted. They were just two people beginning their life together, surrounded by friends and well-wishers. As evening fell, Declan and Margaret retired to their room, now officially theirs as husband and wife. The fire had been lit, and candles gave the space a warm glow. "Mrs. Ingram," Declan said softly, testing the name. "Mrs. Ingram," Margaret repeated, smiling. "I like how that sounds, though I think I will keep Morrison for business matters. My father built that name into something respectable, and I want to honor that." "Margaret Morrison Ingram," Declan said. "That sounds like a woman who can do anything." "I intend to," Margaret said. She moved into his arms, resting her head against his chest. "Thank you, Declan, for giving me back my life, for giving me a future worth living." "Thank you," he replied, "for choosing me, for seeing something in a drifting cowboy worth building a life around." They spent their wedding night in the simple hotel room, discovering each other with tenderness and passion. The world outside could wait. For now, there was just the two of them, bound together by love and choice and the promise of tomorrow. The journey to San Francisco took 3 weeks. They traveled by stage, which was more expensive but faster and more comfortable than horseback. Margaret wanted to arrive in the city looking like the businesswoman she intended to be, not like a refugee from the mountains. The city stunned Declan with its size and noise and sheer number of people. He had been in Denver and Salt Lake City, but San Francisco was something else entirely. The buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high. The streets teemed with traffic, and the bay sparkled with ships from around the world. Margaret's lawyers, Garrison and Holt, had offices in a fine building near the financial district. The senior partner, Arthur Garrison, was a distinguished man in his 60s who greeted Margaret with obvious relief and paternal affection. "My dear, we have been so worried," he said, clasping her hands. "When your uncle's behavior began to seem irregular and we could not reach you, we feared the worst." "Your fears were not unfounded," Margaret said. She introduced Declan, and Garrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the news of their marriage, but he was too much of a gentleman to comment. Over the next 2 hours, Garrison laid out the situation. Harold Morrison had been embezzling from Margaret's inheritance for at least 5 years, using the money to fund his mining ventures and political ambitions. When Margaret began asking questions about her accounts, he had panicked and concocted the scheme to marry her off to Vincent Shaw, thereby consolidating control and making it harder for her to challenge him. The evidence of fraud was substantial, and the territorial authorities were building a criminal case. Morrison was facing potential prison time, and his business empire was crumbling as investors and partners learned of his illegal activities. "As for your inheritance," Garrison said, "we have recovered most of it. Your father's company remains profitable, and we have trustees in place to manage it until you decide what you want to do. You are a wealthy woman, Miss Morrison, or Mrs. Ingram, I should say." Margaret squeezed Declan's hand. "We want to buy land in Nevada," she said. "Good grazing land suitable for cattle ranching, and we will need help setting up the legal structure for the operation." "That can certainly be arranged," Garrison said, warming to the topic. "Nevada is an excellent choice. The territory is growing, and there are opportunities for well-managed ranching operations. How much land are you considering?" They discussed details for another hour. Margaret proved to be as sharp in business as Declan had suspected, asking pointed questions and negotiating terms with Garrison regarding fees and management of her remaining investments. By the time they left the office, they had a plan. Purchase 5,000 acres in the Carson Valley area, stock it with cattle, and build a working ranch from the ground up. They stayed in San Francisco for 2 more weeks, settling Margaret's affairs and preparing for their new life. Declan found the city fascinating but overwhelming. He missed the open spaces and clean air of the mountains. Margaret seemed more comfortable, but even she expressed relief when their business was concluded and they could return to Nevada. "San Francisco will always be part of me," she said as they stood on the deck of the ferry crossing the bay, heading for the railroad depot. "But it is not home anymore. Home is wherever we build it together." They returned to Nevada in early spring, when the snow was melting and the mountains were awakening. The land they purchased was in the Carson Valley, sheltered by mountains on both sides with a river running through it. It was beautiful country with good grass and water, perfect for cattle. The first year was backbreaking work. They hired a crew of ranch hands, men who were initially skeptical of taking orders from a woman but quickly learned that Margaret knew her business. Declan worked alongside them, his experience with cattle proving invaluable. Together, he and Margaret planned the layout of the ranch, deciding where to build the house, the barns, the corrals. The house they built was modest but comfortable, 2 stories with a wide porch and windows that looked out over their land. Margaret insisted on a library, a room devoted entirely to books where she could read and Declan could learn. Declan insisted on a modern kitchen, wanting Margaret to have every convenience available. They called the ranch the Double M, for Morrison and Margaret, though the hands jokingly said it stood for Margaret and her man. The brand they registered was 2 MTKs side by side, simple and distinctive. The cattle they purchased were good stock, Herefords that could handle the Nevada winters. That first year they ran 500 head, learning the rhythms of ranch life together. Declan handled the daily operations and the work with the animals. Margaret managed the business side, keeping the books, negotiating contracts with buyers, handling correspondence with suppliers. They made a formidable team. Where Declan had practical knowledge and experience, Margaret had education and business acumen. Together, they could solve almost any problem the ranch threw at them. Not everything was easy. That first winter was brutal, and they lost cattle to cold and predators. Water rights became an issue with a neighboring rancher, requiring legal intervention. Two of their hands got into a fight that nearly turned deadly, forcing Declan to fire both men. But through it all, their partnership held strong. When Declan was discouraged, Margaret reminded him of how far they had come. When Margaret was overwhelmed by the physical demands of ranch life, Declan was there to share the load and remind her that they were building something that mattered. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked, sharing dreams and plans. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in each other's presence. On their first anniversary, Declan gave Margaret a new horse, a beautiful mare with excellent bloodlines. Margaret gave him a watch engraved with the date they met and the words, "You rode through the storm and found me." "I will cherish this forever," Declan said, emotion thick in his voice. "Not as much as I cherish you," Margaret replied. 2 years after they started the Double M, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror. They were 30 miles from the nearest town with a doctor, and childbirth on the frontier was always risky. But Margaret approached pregnancy with the same practical determination she brought to everything else. She read every book on childbirth she could find and corresponded with a doctor in Carson City who provided advice and agreed to come to the ranch when her time was near. Their son was born on a warm August evening, delivered by the doctor with Declan and a ranch hand's wife named Sarah attending. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Declan feared he would lose them both. But Margaret was strong, and when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Declan wept with relief and joy. They named him Daniel Morrison Ingram, honoring both families. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and from the moment Declan held him, he knew his life had changed forever. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, aided by Sarah's experienced care and Declan's devoted attention. Within weeks, she was back to managing the ranch's business, though now with Daniel nearby in a cradle Declan had built with his own hands. Watching Margaret with their son, seeing her fierce love and gentle care, Declan fell in love with her all over again. She was an amazing mother, just as she was an amazing wife and partner. There seemed to be no end to her strength and capability. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They expanded their operation, purchasing more land and increasing their herd. The Double M gained a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Other ranchers sought Declan's advice, and Margaret became known as a savvy businesswoman who could not be cheated or intimidated. Harold Morrison died in prison 3 years after his conviction for fraud and embezzlement. Margaret felt no joy at the news, but she felt closure. The man who had tried to control and use her was gone, and the life she had built with Declan stood as proof that she had been right to fight for her freedom. Vincent Shaw left Nevada entirely, his reputation destroyed by his association with Morrison. Margaret occasionally wondered what had become of him but found she did not really care. That part of her life was over, finished, as dead as her uncle. On their 5th anniversary, sitting on their porch with Daniel playing at their feet and a second child growing in Margaret's belly, Declan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You ever regret it?" he asked Margaret. "Giving up the life you could have had in San Francisco, all the things that come with being part of society there." Margaret looked at him with surprise and amusement. "Regret? Declan, this is the life I always wanted even when I did not know it existed. I am free. I am myself. I am with the man I love, building something real and lasting. What could I possibly regret? I just worry sometimes that I took you away from a world where you belonged. You did not take me anywhere. I chose to leave that world behind. I chose you. And I would make that choice again every single day." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where their second child was growing. "This is where I belong, Declan. Here with you, with our children on this land we are building into something remarkable. Never doubt that." Their daughter was born the following spring, a healthy girl with her mother's storm-gray eyes. They named her Ellen after Declan's mother. Where Daniel was calm and thoughtful, Ellen was fierce and fearless from the start. Margaret joked that she had inherited the stubbornness of both parents in double measure. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and ranch work. Daniel grew into a capable young man who loved the land and the cattle as much as his father. Ellen surprised them both by developing a passion for horses, becoming an excellent rider and trainer. Margaret taught both children to read and think critically, while Declan taught them to work hard and treat people fairly. The Double M became one of the most successful ranches in the Carson Valley. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and cattle diseases. Through it all, Declan and Margaret's partnership remained the foundation of everything they built. On their 20th anniversary, they threw a celebration that became legendary in the valley. Friends and neighbors came from 50 miles around. William Barnes, now in his 80s, made the trip with his grandson. Sheriff Kendrick, retired now but still sharp, attended with his wife. Even Mrs. Chen came from Pine Ridge, bringing her famous dumplings and enough gossip to entertain everyone for hours. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Declan and Margaret stood on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Daniel and Ellen were somewhere nearby with friends, their laughter drifting on the evening air. 20 years, Margaret said softly. Sometimes it feels like 20 minutes, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I found your letter buried in snow, Declan said, repeating words he had spoken many times over the years. And I rode through the storm to find you. And I wrote that letter never really believing anyone would come, Margaret replied, continuing their familiar refrain. But you did. You saved me. We saved each other, Declan corrected, pulling her close. I was drifting before I found you. You gave me purpose, a reason to build instead of just survive. Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at his face. The years had added some gray to his hair and lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day he had appeared in that hallway at Silverbrook, a stranger risking everything for someone he had never met. I love you, she said. More now than even on the day we married, and I did not think that was possible. I love you too, Declan said. Every day more than the day before. That is my promise to you for whatever years we have left, to love you more each day than I did the one before. They kissed there on their porch, under the stars they had watched together for 20 years. Around them, the ranch they had built hummed with life and possibility. Their children were growing into remarkable people. Their land was productive and beautiful. Their life together was everything they had dreamed and more. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but the love forged in that desperate journey through snow and danger had only grown stronger with time. They had built something lasting, something real, something worth every risk and hardship they had endured. Daniel eventually took over the day-to-day operations of the Double M, bringing his own innovations while respecting the foundation his parents had built. Ellen married a horse trainer from California and started her own ranch nearby, specializing in breeding quality riding horses. Both gave Declan and Margaret grandchildren who filled the old ranch house with laughter and life. As they grew older, Declan and Margaret spent more time on their porch, watching the world they had created continue to grow and thrive. They still worked, still contributed to the ranch's success, but the daily grind was left to younger hands. You remember that first night in the line shack? Margaret asked one evening, her hand in Declan's as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. "When you told me we would get through it together." "I remember being terrified that I had made promises I could not keep," Declan admitted. "I had no idea how we would escape, how I would keep you safe. But you did. You kept every promise you ever made to me." "We kept them to each other," Declan said. "That is what partnership means." In their later years, they became the story that people told around fires and at gatherings. The tale of the cowboy who found a desperate letter buried in snow and rode through a blizzard to save a woman he had never met. The story of the society woman who gave up everything for love and freedom, who built an empire from dirt and determination. But to Declan and Margaret, it was never a story. It was simply their life, lived fully and without regret. They had chosen each other in that desperate moment in Silverbrook, and they chose each other again every day after. That choice, renewed constantly, was the foundation of everything good they had created. Declan passed first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by his family. Margaret held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and promises to see him again. She lived for another 5 years, managing the ranch and doting on her grandchildren. But everyone who knew her could see that part of her had gone with Declan. The fierce fire that had driven her through so many years had banked to embers, waiting to be rekindled. On the anniversary of the day they met, 50 years after Declan found her letter buried in snow, Margaret passed away in her sleep in the house they had built together. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful and smiling, her hand resting on the journal where she had written their story in her careful script. They buried her next to Declan on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the same mountains where their journey had begun. On the headstone, Daniel had carved the words, "She wrote, he rode, they loved. Together they built a legacy." The Double M continued for generations, always staying in the family, always honoring the partnership that had created it. And on cold winter nights, when snow fell on the Nevada mountains, people still told the story of the cowboy who rode through the storm for love, and the woman who was brave enough to write that letter and trust in the kindness of strangers. It was a story of courage and choice, of love that transformed 2 lives and created something larger than either could have built alone. It was, in the end, exactly the story Margaret had written with her desperate letter all those years ago. A plea for help that became a testament to the power of human connection, of bravery in the face of fear, of love that refused to accept the limitations the world tried to impose. And if sometimes, on those cold winter nights, someone claimed to see 2 figures on the porch of the old ranch house, hands clasped and watching the stars together, no one who knew the story was surprised. Some loves are strong enough to transcend even death, built on foundations so solid that not even time can erode them. Declan and Margaret's love was that kind of love. It started with a letter buried in snow and a cowboy brave enough to ride through the storm. It grew through adversity and triumph, through the building of a life and the raising of a family. And it endured, a testament to the truth that real love, chosen freely and nurtured faithfully, can create miracles. Their story became part of the land itself, woven into the history of the Carson Valley and the Double M Ranch. Children grew up hearing about the woman who wrote the letter and the man who answered her call. Young couples looked to Declan and Margaret's partnership as an example of what marriage could be at its best. Equal, supportive, built on mutual respect and genuine love. The ranch they built continued to prosper under Daniel's careful stewardship and later under his children. The Double M brand became synonymous with quality and integrity, values Declan and Margaret had instilled from the very beginning. Workers who came to the ranch found not just employment but a philosophy about treating people fairly and building something that would last beyond any single generation. Ellen's horse ranch, the Silver Storm named for her mother's eyes, became equally renowned. Between the two properties, the Ingram family became one of the most respected names in Nevada ranching, known not just for their success, but for their ethics and their commitment to the land and community. In Carson City, a scholarship was established in Margaret's name for young women seeking education in business and law. The fund, seeded by Margaret's will and maintained by her descendants, helped hundreds of women pursue dreams that might otherwise have been impossible. It was fitting that Margaret's legacy included lifting up others, as Declan had once lifted her up. The story of how they met became part of Nevada folklore, told and retold until it took on almost mythic proportions. But the family kept Margaret's journal, the true account written in her own hand, preserved carefully for future generations. In it, she had captured not just the events but the emotions, the fear and hope and love that had transformed two strangers into soulmates. Daniel's son, Declan II, eventually donated portions of the journal to the Nevada Historical Society, ensuring that the authentic story would be preserved even as the legend grew. Visitors to the society could read Margaret's elegant script, see the careful way she had documented the journey from captivity to freedom, from loneliness to love. The original letter, the one Declan had found buried in snow, was framed and hung in the ranch house, a reminder of where everything had begun. Beneath it, in Declan's rougher handwriting, was a note he had written years later. "I found this letter on the worst day of winter, and it led me to the best years of my life. Never doubt that one small act of courage can change everything." As decades passed and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Double M adapted to changing times while maintaining its core values. The Ingram family weathered world wars and economic depressions, droughts and changing markets. Through it all, the story of Declan and Margaret remained central to the family's identity, a reminder of where they had come from and what they stood for. Great-grandchildren who never knew Declan and Margaret personally still grew up hearing their story, still felt the influence of those two remarkable people who had chosen love over convenience, courage over comfort. The values they had lived by, partnership and integrity and hard work, were passed down like precious heirlooms. On the 100th anniversary of Declan finding Margaret's letter, the family held a reunion at the Double M. Descendants came from all over the country, some who still worked the land and others who had pursued different paths. But all of them knew the story. All of them understood that they existed because a cowboy had been brave enough to ride through a storm, and a woman had been brave enough to write a letter asking for help. They gathered on the hill where Declan and Margaret were buried, sharing stories and memories. The ranch stretched out below them, still productive and beautiful, still bearing the mark of the people who had built it from nothing. In that moment, Looking at the land and the family that filled it, the legacy of that desperate letter and that courageous ride was clear. It was not just about a ranch or money or success, though all of those things had come. It was about proving that love chosen freely and built on mutual respect could create something that lasted. It was about showing that one person's courage to ask for help and another person's courage to answer could change not just two lives, but generations of lives yet to come. As the sun set on that 100th anniversary, painting the same mountains in the same gold and red light that Declan and Margaret had watched for so many years, their descendants stood together in silence. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it echoes of the past and promises for the future. And if someone had asked any of those gathered people if they believed in love, in destiny, in the power of one small act of courage to change the world, every single one would have answered yes. Because they were living proof of it, every day, on the land that love had built. The story that began with a letter buried in snow and a cowboy riding through a storm had become something larger than either Declan or Margaret could have imagined. It had become a testament to the best of human nature, the courage to ask for help, the bravery to offer it, and the wisdom to build something lasting from a moment of desperate chance. Their love story was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real, flawed and difficult, and absolutely true. It was a reminder that the greatest loves often begin in the unlikeliest circumstances, that the strongest partnerships are built by people who choose each other every day, and that legacy is measured not in what we accumulate, but in what we create and who we become together. Declan Ingram rode through the storm because it was the right thing to do. Margaret Morrison wrote that letter because she refused to give up hope. Together, they proved that sometimes, when courage meets courage and love meets love, miracles happen. And the ranch they built, the family they created, the values they lived by, all of it stood as permanent testament to a simple truth. Love, real and true and chosen freely, can change the world. One letter at a time, one courageous ride at a time, one life built together at a time. That was the legacy of Declan and Margaret Ingram. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every hardship. Not a fairy tale, but better than any fairy tale could ever be. It was simply love in its truest and finest form, and that was everything.